Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. I'm Boris Tizenghausen. June 20th. Here are the main news stories at this moment. Ukrainian drones have attacked the Tyumen Oil Refinery. This refinery is located more than 2,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. That's in a straight line. A major fire is still ongoing at the facility. Local authorities have reported that everything is under control, but the fire can already be seen from several dozen kilometers away. Even if not now, if they didn't finish it off this time, they definitely will. Ukrainian drones, they're like that. But 2,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border is a very serious distance. At this point, no air defense in Russia is enough to cover such distances. Well, it's also important that these 2,000 kilometers were actually flown by drones over Russian territory, and they weren't shot down until they reached Tyumen. And perhaps the most important news, for the first time in history, Zelenskyy has issued a tough military ultimatum to Lukashenko. Let me quote, "I'm not offended by Lukashenko's words, but along the regions bordering Ukraine, there is equipment that is adjusting fire on the Ukrainian population. I'm giving a week for its withdrawal, otherwise we will do it ourselves." So in other words, Zelenskyy openly said that if this equipment is not dismantled within a week, then Ukraine, they will take care of it themselves. I think everything is perfectly clear here and doesn't require any further explanation. Let me remind you that the infrastructure on the territory of Belarus is being increasingly used to support Russian strikes. We're talking about relay stations and also ground communication and drone control stations. These relay stations help Russian Shaheds and reconnaissance drones operate in the northern direction, here in our territory. In fact, for many years, Kyiv has been openly making it clear to Minsk, further participation in the Russian military campaign will have direct consequences for Belarus itself. Lukashenko is facing very serious problems. But what are these relay stations for, and why are they located on the territory of Belarus? Drones are controlled via a radio communication channel. The farther a drone moves away from the control point, the weaker the signal becomes. In addition, radio waves are limited by the terrain and the curvature of the Earth. That is, over long distances, the direct connection can simply disappear, especially if a Shahed is flying at low altitudes. To prevent this from happening, relay stations are placed along the drone's route, which both receive and transmit the signal. To put it simply, it's like cell towers for mobile phones, except these are for Shaheds. Essentially, what is being created is a kind of radio corridor toward Ukraine, which allows Russian drones to maintain a stable signal at a considerable distance from the operator. So these repeaters are most often installed on standard cell towers in Belarus, including those belonging to Belarusian mobile operators. In other words, I probably won't be revealing any secrets by saying that the providers whose towers in Belarus host these repeaters can't do anything without instructions from the Belarusian authorities. That is, communications there are under the complete control of the state and special services. And so Russian drones can freely operate, flying in precisely from the territory of Belarus, along or near the border. The border between Ukraine and Belarus, there are four main reasons why Russia places equipment there on the territory of Belarus. First, geometry and range. Belarus. Geographically, it hangs over Ukraine. The Kyiv, Chernihiv, Zhytomyr, and Rivne regions border it. So by placing a repeater on the territory of Belarus, Russia gains the ability to extend its control signal deep inside, with these drones of theirs. Secondly, in this way, they can effectively cover their operators. That is, if the operators are located on the territory of Belarus, those who control these drones, then we do not strike Belarus, so they are safe there. And the third point, which is also very important, in this way they bypass our electronic warfare systems. That is, our system for countering Russian drones is primarily focused on the frontline area, targeting strikes coming from Russian territory and from the occupied territories. That's the direction it's aimed at. But from the north, that's exactly where the drones, and they receive their signal. Therefore, if we also have to deploy electronic warfare systems along the entire length of the Belarusian border and direct them toward Belarusian territory, it becomes extremely, extremely costly. And of course, the political logic, the fourth point, is also important. In other words, this is a way to de facto draw Belarus into the war as an accomplice, even if only through its infrastructure, without officially declaring it. Lukashenko formally seems not to be at war, but his territory is being used as a technical staging ground. And of course, we all remember and will never forget that it was through the territory of Belarus in February 2022 that Russian troops advanced toward Kiev, toward Bucha, toward Irpin. Missiles were launched from Belarusian airfields and training grounds, and Russian troops and equipment were transported via the Belarusian railway. So we remember all of this very well. For Lukashenko, the situation looks extremely unpleasant and alarming. Honestly, I have no doubt that these relay stations will be destroyed if he doesn't remove them himself. Ukraine is not in a position to play any games with them, and this infrastructure, including this, it concerns the lives of Ukrainians, so the situation is difficult for Lukashenko. By the way, he himself recently admitted that Ukrainian drones could wipe out all his military facilities in a matter of hours. If such an order is given, and even the expired Draniki recently tried to apologize to Zelenskyy, you probably remember, and I think that the last straw for Ukraine was, even if only formally, still an attempt to accuse Ukraine of striking the bus. With Belarusian children, even though Lukashenko knew perfectly well whose doing it was, that it was Putin who did it. The Belarusian economy is especially vulnerable right now. In fact, there are only 2 oil refineries there. Oil refining and petrochemicals are actually the main sources of foreign currency revenue for Belarus, so a strike on the 2 Belarusian oil refineries, there are only 2 major ones, would instantly collapse the entire Belarusian economy. Therefore, the current ultimatum is a signal that the era when the mustachioed guy could participate without actually taking part in the war with Ukraine and not bear, any direct risks for it, that era has come to an end. Next time, someone is definitely going to get hit right in the gut, and just in case. Let me remind you that the distance from the border with Ukraine to Lukashenko's main oil refinery, the Mozyr Oil Refinery, is 30 kilometers. So now is the perfect time to go after Lukashenko, to pull out the map and once again show where the attack on Belarus is supposedly being prepared from. And just in case, I think he definitely will. Right now, he's probably ready to make a run for the Moscow region at a moment's notice. Or maybe even farther away, towards Beijing, for example. It's also worth mentioning that, in fact, with this statement, Zelenskyy has thrown a lifeline to Lukashenko himself. In other words, it gives Putin an argument, like I'm washing my hands of this, or they'll destroy all my oil refineries, they'll blow up my refineries. So you see what kind of statement they've made over there. So it's an argument and an excuse for Lukashenko himself in front of Putin. But here's the thing. Lukashenko and Putin, like oil and water, might not be able to see eye to eye. By the way, lately there's been a kind of hopelessness in Lukashenko's eyes. Have you noticed? They probably understand where all this is heading. And one more important point, a crucial trend. I've noticed it for a long time. The hotter things get for him, the more he retreats into his collective farm persona. Valentia Lukashenko noted. Whenever Lukashenko faces a serious problem, he immediately rushes off to a collective farm and does a report from there with the cows. Today I check his Telegram channel. It's a textbook example of a collective farm there. Let me quote, actually. Lukashenko was given a cow named Musya as a gift. A photo of Musya the cow. Musya is going to the presidential farm. Musya called Lukashenko a good person. Well, more precisely, she accepted him as a good person. So it's the highest, the most full-blown level of collective farm antics there. And that means the problem is very serious. By the way, friends, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. It's important for the channel's growth. You can do it right now. We're fighting against Putin's propaganda. Together, it'll be much easier and more effective to do this. So make sure to subscribe. Here's another piece of news. Zakharova, it seems, has risen up from somewhere. Judging by her appearance, Armenian soldiers will be taught to fight against Russia, said Maria Zakharova. Let me quote her. It's no secret to anyone that during this kind of training, our country is positioned as the likely adversary, and that NATO's supposed goal is to continue pulling the Republic away from its traditional ally, Russia. So that's what she's saying. That's how she reacted to the joint exercises between Armenia and NATO countries. They will be taught how to fight against Russia. But why is Russia being positioned as the likely adversary? Does anyone have any theories? It's truly the riddle of the century, like a 2-star problem from Kanavi's problem book. Let's rephrase what Zakharova said. They will be teaching Armenian soldiers to fight against an aggressive, outright occupier and imperialist who constantly attacks its neighbors and questions their independence and sovereignty. Other states, Right now, Russia is that outright occupier, so naturally, they will be taught to fight against them. Or maybe it's Latvia or Kazakhstan who are constantly attacking their neighbors. Here's another bonus question. And why have almost all of Russia's neighbors turned away from it? No one knows. Let me also remind you that Armenia was threatened quite recently. On May 30th, Putin hinted at a Ukrainian scenario for Armenia, if it continues moving toward the European direction. So why is Russia considered the aggressor? Who knows? Here in Ukraine, unfortunately, we know firsthand what kind of unreasonable neighbor we have. And in every episode, we have an important fundraiser for the defense forces of Ukraine, who are performing an incredible feat right now. Today, we are continuing to raise funds for mobile command posts for our forces, air defense for our hunters of Russian drones and missiles, for several air defense units, and the 152nd Jaeger Brigade. The soldiers have recorded a video message for you. Please take a look.
152 бригада і підрозділ повітряних сил України та канал Бориса Тізенгаузена починають збір на 2 командні пункти, щоб збивати шахеди над нашими містами і запускати дрони-перехоплювачі. Сума чимала, але тільки разом ми можемо дати ворогу по зубам.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Let's help our warriors. The link to the fundraiser is in the description of this video. There is Mono, Privat, and PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. Be sure to use the QR code, especially if you're watching on other channels. It also leads to the fundraiser. By helping our air defense forces, you are directly saving someone's life. These mobile command posts, the more of them there are, the more effective they are. Both Shaheds and missiles are being shot down. In short, our fighters need our help. And in every episode, I say a huge thank you to everyone who helps, to Ukraine and to our warriors. Thank you so much. Russia has the right to use virtually any methods of warfare against Ukraine. That's Medvedev crawling out of his hole again, this semi-liquid Terminator. Let me quote, "Only one condition should remain beyond what is acceptable for us. Deliberate destruction of civilians." I emphasize deliberate, meaning knowingly intentional. Everything else is quite permissible. So killing Ukrainians with missiles and drones unintentionally, that's allowed, says Medvedev. That's allowed, says Medvedev. But they're absolutely insane. Even that little drunkard keeps repeating that Ukraine must disappear. For Putin, Ukraine is a constant reminder of his defeat. And for Russia as a whole, too. So right now there are even more risks, both for Putin and the Russian Federation. Just look at the events of recent months. Moscow is burning, St. Petersburg is burning. Dozens of Russian regions are experiencing fuel shortages. Crimea is being cut off from logistics, and Ukraine is reclaiming more territory than Russia is occupying. And that's just in the past few months. And have you noticed how their rhetoric toward Europe has become almost maximally aggressive? Let's strike at them. At this Europe, let's hit their factories. There's Medvedev, that bum, Dr. Evil S, AliExpress. He's always going on about this. He even recently waved around a list of factories in Europe that produce weapons for Ukraine. That's it. They need to be bombed. They must be bombed. So why are they so rattled right now? Because Europe, unfortunately, took a long time to get started, but fortunately now it's moving fast. For 4 years, there was some kind of bureaucratic red tape, procedures. They were setting up production, which is also not a quick process, allocating funding, which took a long time, but now they're moving full speed ahead. That is, Ukraine will receive hundreds of thousands of drones already this year. Everyone's geared up. Hide in the wheat, you half-pint ethanol guy. And the recent record, almost 1,000 drones in a single day against Russia. And by autumn, with that kind of quantity, everything will be burning like twaps and the refinery in Kapu. That's what part of Russia will look like. And what can Russia do in response? What exactly? Will the Botox jellyfish strike Ukraine again with Hazel missiles? Or will there be another massive shelling of Kyiv? But those attacks haven't stopped anyway. They'll burn down our market at Lukyanivka, at Shulyavka again. What kind of image can you give to a Russian to overshadow the sight of a burning oil refinery? Right outside his window? Black rain. What kind of image can you give to a Muscovite? What now? That any moment now we'll take Mala Takmachka? Seriously. And after all, no one has cancelled the crisis in Russia. Even though they did finally catch Nabiulina somewhere in the woods and dragged her out. Putting her on screen to at least calm Russian citizens a little didn't really help. And it's no longer possible to hide the news about widespread wage arrears. Today, for example, there's news that in Nizhny Novgorod, workers have stopped the construction of the metro due to unpaid wages. Moreover, the workers involved in this construction complain that they haven't been paid for several months. The situation is happening all over Russia. Hundreds of enterprises operating in Russia are forced either to lay off employees, delay salaries, or both. Meanwhile, Putin sits contentedly at a summit in Kazan, laughing and telling everyone that he and his old senile KGB cronies are deliberately cooling down the economy, just in case, God forbid, the Russian economy hasn't outpaced everyone. They are deliberately holding back the numbers, can you imagine? Yes, with a straight face, completely seriously. Putin sits there and claims they're deliberately cooling down the economy so that apparently Russia doesn't accidentally overtake the US and China combined. But to make things even more amusing for Putin, here's another piece of news. Last night, the armed forces struck again at the remaining bridges in Crimea, destroying the Henikask bridge. The Russians are now trying to set up ferry crossings there, and in some places they're even attempting to build new crossings, but none of this will last long. In other words, our forces have zeroed in on the targets there. And what's interesting is that because these makeshift pontoon crossings are much slower to cross, a significant number of trucks and fuel tankers are piling up there. I think our forces have already taken note of this. Soon, over this so-called highway of death to Crimea through the Azov region, drones will be hovering over this road around the clock. Meanwhile, in Crimea, the beaches are empty. Completely empty. Expect news from our Crimean partisans soon. Many interesting things are happening there, likely in tomorrow's episode, so make sure to subscribe. Bulgaria has threatened to veto the 21st package of European Union sanctions against Russia if Patriarch Kirill and restrictions that are dangerous for the Bulgarian economy are not excluded from it. You see, the restrictions that are dangerous for the Bulgarian economy, they're talking about Lukoil there. They say I can still understand it from an economic point of view when they look at it, but to exclude Patriarch Kirill, that is, Orbán's legacy lives on. Previously, it was Orbán who would go all out for him, but here it's not even about the pro-Russian sentiments of Bulgarian Prime Minister Rumen Radev. I could still understand if it were like, let's talk about the economic bloc, give us some concessions here and there. Well, I could still get that. But everyone falls apart, everyone crumbles when it comes to the topic of Patriarch Kirill, the patriarch of the entire FSB. The next step, I think, will be, just like with Orbán, an attempt to remove Russian oligarchs from the sanctions lists, just like Orbán did, remember? Here, it's not even specifically about the Bulgarian Prime Minister or Orbán, so that some hypothetical Orbán doesn't keep popping up every time. What really needs to be done is to change the voting and decision-making system in the European Union. Then Russia won't even need to have this hypothetical Orbán who is constantly throwing a wrench in the works. If voting is done by a simple majority, then whether it's Bulgaria, Hungary, or Slovakia, no one will be able to slow down this process. And about Orbán, by the way, dark clouds are gathering over him. He wanted to get immunity for himself. But something went wrong. He wanted to get re-elected there to some positions, so Orbán was legally stripped of the opportunity to be re-elected as Prime Minister. A corresponding amendment was introduced, and now he won't be able to be re-elected as Prime Minister. And about Donald Trump, this is a fantastic piece of news. I just happened to come across it. Donald Trump wanted to award himself, but Congress forbade him from doing so. Let me quote, "There have been many of the greatest people who have ever walked the earth, but only a few have received our highest military award, the Congressional Medal of Honor. I wanted to award it to myself, but I was told that I can't do that." And that's Donald Trump. I think that even if I hadn't said it was Donald Trump, everyone would have realized those words belonged to him. If I were reading this news about, some grandpa just goofing around in retirement, honestly, there wouldn't be any questions at all. You walk out by your building entrance and there's an old man sitting there saying, "Tonight, an entire civilization will perish." And you're like, yeah, sure. Okay, grandpa, just don't forget to take your pills. Well, all right, but this is the President of the United States, who can start a war with a snap of his fingers, and by the way, can end a war just as easily. Do you understand? This is the President of the United States. But to be fair, I always say that Donald Trump imposed sanctions on Russian oil companies. He did what the Joseph Biden administration perhaps lacked the courage, maybe the bravery or something else to do. And unlike the Joseph Biden administration, no one is currently asking Ukraine not to strike Russian oil refineries. So it's always important to be objective as well. In this regard, Trump did a good job, but I wanted to award myself the highest honor. But I was forbidden to do so, of course, yes. Well, friends, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. And let's help our air defense fighters. They have a lot of work right now. The link to the fundraiser is in the description of this video. Have a peaceful day, everyone, and glory to Ukraine.